Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, the creator and host of the award-winning podcast that you're listening to right now. Thank you so much, called Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. It is a daily podcast, 365 days a year, and each day we talk to an author about all of the things related to their career, their book, their life, and more in 30 minutes or less, because who has time? I am now an author myself, although I wasn't when I started this podcast, and you can get my new memoir, Bookends, a memoir of love, loss, and literature, wherever books are sold starting July 1st, and my children's book, Princess Charming. You can learn more about me at zibbyowens.com, but really you're here to learn more about the authors, and that is what we're going to do. Also, be sure to check out all the other podcasts in the Zcast Podcast Network. You can learn more at zcastnetwork.com and definitely check out those shows as well. Mary Frances O'Connor is the author of The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. This is one of our guest-hosted episodes by Allison Pataki. Mary Frances is an associate professor of clinical psychology and psychiatry at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on the physiological correlates of emotion, in particular the wide range of physical and emotional responses during bereavement, including yearning and isolation. She believes that a clinical science approach toward the experience and mechanisms of grieving can improve interventions for prolonged grief disorder, newly included in the revised DSM-5.
Mary Frances O'Connor, author of The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I am so excited to speak with you about this incredible, important book. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here.
Absolutely. So, Mary Frances, you are a writer, a researcher, a professor, a mentor. You wear many incredible hats, and that makes you the perfect person to write this book. So can you tell us a little bit about the how and the why, the story behind the story of how you came to write The Grieving Brain?
This has been a passion of mine for, over 2 decades now, which kind of boggles my mind. So I've been studying grief, as you say, grief and grieving, as a clinical psychologist, as a neuroscientist. So I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, and my lab, which is called the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, the GLASS lab we call it, is really devoted to understanding, just as you said, sort of the why is grieving so hard, and why does it take so long, and how might it be working in the brain? Are there things about the brain that are making it easier or harder? But there's another piece of it too, which is that, I feel really comfortable with people who are grieving. And I think largely that's because when I was 13, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And so we had, grief at home, so to speak. And she amazingly did not die until I was 26, which her oncologist called his first miracle. But wow. It means that I just feel comfortable with people who are going through this. And so maybe that made it easier for me to do the, by now, hundreds of interviews that I've done with grieving people and try to map that onto what their physiology is telling us.
Yeah. So you talk about in your book how when you share with people that you work with grief and grieving, or when you're telling people that you're writing this book, a lot of us who are not as well versed as you are, particularly in sort of Western culture, you say we have this idea of the 5 stages of grief. And you say that it's presented to us as sort of this linear narrative with the forward marching heroic story where we end with acceptance. Yeah. And you say that's not at all how grief works, the science and the brain and human behavior and experience. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was so fascinating.
So many of your listeners may have heard of the 5 stages of grieving or the 5 stages of grief, as it was called. And Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I have total respect for. She was a female psychiatrist when there were not a lot of female psychiatrists. She actually was prevented from taking a faculty position twice because she was pregnant, and she raised children and so forth. So an amazing woman.
Yeah.
And she really, her contribution was she gave us this revolutionary idea you could interview people who were terminally ill, which at the time in the 1960s was unheard of, to ask them what they were feeling and how they were coping. And so she did what all good scientists do initially, was that she described what people were telling her, right? She gave us a very accurate description that people do experience depression. They experience anger. They even experience denial. And so the way I think about it now as we look back, because science has come a long way since 1969, is that she gave us a description of grief. But that the idea that grieving, that change over time, that it, you do all of denial and then all of anger and and you never go back again to those natural human emotions is just not accurate. And I think when we use it as a prescription rather than a description, then people get into trouble because they think, well, I haven't had a lot of anger. Maybe I'm not doing it right. Or, I felt a lot of acceptance and now I'm having a day where I feel really depressed. Am I doing something wrong?
Yeah.
And so we don't think of it as doing something wrong. We have more updated models that we often use now as looking at sort of the trajectory rather than these 5 stages, which are really 5 experiences people have.
Yeah. And there's no set order. There's no checking one off and then you've graduated to the next level, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk about the difference between grief and depression?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think part of it is helpful maybe to start with distinguishing, I've been using the word grief and the word grieving as though they're different. And most of us, we use those interchangeably. This really came about from studying, what is it I'm studying? Am I studying grief here? I'm not getting the answers that I'm looking for about grieving. And so making this distinction became useful to me and I think has become useful to other people. So grief is that natural response when you become aware that something so important to you is missing. Right? It's that wave of feeling, it's those thoughts, it's that sort of unbearable awfulness.
Yeah.
And it recedes, right? It comes in waves. Grieving, on the other hand, is the way that feeling of grief might change over time. So think about it this way. If I'm doing a scientific study of grief, I can ask you how you're feeling right now. For example, right? How much grief are you feeling? But if I want to study grieving, I have to ask you, how has your feeling changed from before to now, or from a long time before to, this sort of change over time means that grieving is the way grief can become more familiar. It could become less intense, or those waves could be less frequent. But that doesn't mean that grief goes away, because that's just the natural human response, right? When we're aware of missing someone. Yeah. So I think that's useful because people often feel like, gosh, I'm having this week where I'm just completely overwhelmed. Yeah. And then they realize, this is the anniversary of when a loved one died. And we know, even in the research, we can see anniversaries, we see this big increase in grief. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your grieving. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means this is a change in this moment of your grief.
Yeah. And you talk about how we as humans can hold the knowledge, both truths at the same time, where we know that the loved one is gone. We know we miss them. We know we're grieving. But then we have these moments where we expect them to walk back through the door, or where we expect them to show up to dinner with us. How does the brain do that? How do we as people hold both of those things?
The brain is a uniquely fascinating organ that sort of is trying to help us. But the brain also has some limitations. And one of those strange limitations is it can be listening to 2 streams of information at the same time. So when we think about this in terms of bereavement, in order for us to have the feeling of grief, the feeling of loss, we first have to have the feeling of love, of bonding, right? And that bond gets encoded in our brain, literally physically your brain has changed because you loved this person and they loved you, you know? And so part of what comes with that attachment is the belief, right? I will always be there for you and you will always be there for me. And the important piece of that is the always part, right? It is impossible to imagine just going off to work every day if you didn't deeply believe that you would all come back together again at the end of the day, right? We have this deep belief. They're out there for me somewhere, you know, I'm thinking about them through the day. I know how I would get a hold of them if I needed to. So with attachment comes this everlasting belief, so to speak. Well, when we have the death of a loved one, there is, of course, this other set of information that the brain encodes, which are the memories, right? You may have been there at the bedside when a loved one was dying or when they passed away, or even you may have been at the funeral or memorial, right? So you have these memories. You know that the reality is that they're no longer on this earthly plane. But you can see then how these two streams of information conflict. On the one hand, because of this bond, you have this belief they'll always be there. They're out there somewhere. And if they're not here, it just means I need to go get them. I need to find them and bring them back. And on the other hand, you also know they're not living. And so I think part of why grieving takes so long is that the brain takes a very long time to make sense of these two things. And maybe the most concrete way to think about it is the brain is always trying to make predictions for us, right? It's trying to predict what happens, and it makes those predictions based on what's happened before. So say if you wake up next to your spouse for hundreds and maybe even thousands of days, right? You wake up, they're next to you. Then on the first morning that you wake up and they're not there in the bed with you, it's actually not a very good prediction that they've died, right? So for a while, for your brain, it's as though they haven't died. There's a learning that has to take place to be able to predict their absence. And what does that absence mean for your life, as opposed to the sort of habitual prediction of, and there they are, you know?
And yet there will always be these triggers like a smell or coming across a shirt or something that will tell our brain that the person is there for a minute, and then we have to remember, right?
That's absolutely right. Handwriting is the thing for me. I'll come across something my mother wrote, you know, it'll fall out of a book or something.
Yeah.
And boy, in that moment, she feels so alive, right?
Yeah.
Like she just wrote it and sent it. And that is how it works. The brain permanently encodes this bond, which maybe has a sort of, I mean, I actually take great comfort in the fact that in a way she is a part of me, right? Like she's my brain is physically including the fact that we had a relationship, that we were so tightly bonded, and somehow carrying that around with me is very comforting.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we care about someone or we're close with somebody who's going through the grieving process, you're very comfortable with it. It's, you know, it's your world, but it can be hard. It can be challenging to see someone you love really struggling. And you talk about the prongs of empathy. What can we do? What should we do to show empathy or to show up for someone who is grieving?
This is a tricky one, because while I say I feel very comfortable with people who are grieving, and that is true, people who are grieving, it's really hard, right? It is really hard to watch someone who's suffering or who's really angry, right? I mean, grief brings with it a lot of anger, quite unintentionally. You know, it's not like the person wants to feel angry, but, you know, there's often nothing you can do that won't make them angry. And so I think then it's incumbent on us a little bit to recognize, for this person, they're just not themselves at the moment. And the emotion dial has just, on everything, has just been turned way up. So, you know, it's interesting to think about so many of our social sort of mourning practices. I think in some ways we're reminding other people, right? So you wear a black armband, for example, reminding the people around you that they're having a different experience day to day than you are right now, you know? So a friend of ours, a friend in my sort of circle of friends, his mother had died maybe 3 months before this happened. And we were in a parking lot after something we'd been doing together, and he got really angry and he said something really kind of mean to one of our friends. And, you know, and everyone was sort of like, what the heck? What was that? You know, this is very out of character. And it wasn't true. And, you know, and I said later to them, we have to remember that, you know, he is still grieving and everything is just raw right now. So when I think about being with people who are grieving, I think one of the biggest quagmires we get ourselves into is that as the person who wants to be supportive and wants to be kind, often our goal is sort of to cheer them up.
Right. Right.
And unfortunately, think about it this way. If you're already not feeling yourself in the world, you're not, now you also have this expectation that someone wants you to feel happy as well. Yeah. Like that's just a whole lot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so sometimes I think if we can sort of change our mindset to, I want to be with you, right? Yeah. I want you to know you're not alone, and that I am open to however and whatever you want as this goes forward. Yeah. A friend of mine whose little boy died, she says, you know, we think the golden rule is the most important thing. Treat others as you would like to be treated. She says there's actually a platinum rule. Treat others as they would like to be treated.
Oh, that's so good.
Right?
That's so good. Yeah. Yeah. Because you can't put the expectation or the burden onto them, you know, to then live up to whatever they're expecting to receive from you. Yeah. That's so good. And you say grief is a door through which we will all walk. And some of us earlier than others, some of us more often than others, but it is a universal human experience.
It is, but it comes at different times, doesn't it? And in different ways. And and we all have different sort of capacities for sharing and for disclosing and for supporting even. So, you know, it may be, often people say, it's not even that I need to talk, it's that I need someone to help me clean out the closet, you know, or I need someone to take my kids to the park because I just need some time. And so I think trying to ask people, and not even just what can I do, right? Because that's pretty broad and doesn't always sound like an actual offer. So saying things like, hey, I know that Thanksgiving's coming up and that might be a really tough time for you. Is there some shopping I could do? I'm already going to be, you know, setting my own table. Is there any, could I come over and help with, you know, X? Can I, you know, take the kids on Wednesday so you can get, you know, giving kind of concrete examples of things that you might do. And then letting them sort of decide. And I'll tell you, here's a great example. One of the students, I teach a psychology of death and loss class, and one of the students was telling a story about she and her boyfriend lived next door to this older couple, and the husband died in this older couple. And so the following Christmas, he had always put up Christmas lights on the house. And so her boyfriend went over and said, hey, you know, I wanted to offer, I'd be happy to put up your Christmas lights this year if you wanted. And she got really angry and said, I don't need that from you, and sort of slammed the door. And he was like, oh God, you know, what have I done?
Yeah, yeah.
And about 24 hours later, she came and knocked on the door and she said, I'm so sorry. You know, it just is so hard for me that he's not here, that I just reacted. But I would actually really love it if you would help me put up Christmas lights, you know? So I think that's a great example of both offering something. It doesn't always go well, but that's not your last opportunity, you know?
Yeah. And extending the grace when there is anger or there is an outsized reaction you might not have felt you expected. You talk about restoration to a meaningful life as a worthwhile goal or aspiration. Can you talk about what that means and what a meaningful life means?
One of the models that we use more contemporarily that many clinicians, I think, find very useful now is what we call this dual process model. And what it suggests is that on the one hand, we have all these stresses about the actual death, the actual loss, right? All these emotions and thoughts and, you know, what do we do now and all that? What do we do with those feelings? And those we call loss stressors. But we also have what they call restoration stressors, which is sort of, what does this mean for my life now? And who am I? And, what is retirement supposed to look like if my spouse has died? Or how am I supposed to parent if my co-parent is gone? So all of those, what does life look like now? And how do I, given that I am a person who has grief, how do I continue to have a meaningful life, to do meaningful things? And that takes a long time and a lot of courage and, frankly, a lot of support. Yeah. So when I think about what is a meaningful life, what's interesting, of course, about this for me is I think that's a question we're all asking ourselves all the time, right? That doesn't only happen when a loved one dies. It's just that because when a loved one dies, you get the rug ripped out from under you. Things that previously felt really meaningful sometimes don't feel very meaningful anymore.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out, okay, so what is this like now? I think can come to, I think there's a couple of things that people can do. They can think about what it is they value, kind of at its most basic. And that can be related to the person who's died. So, what things do I know my mom would have been proud of me for doing, right? Or even just how would she have done things? My mom was British, and so there are things I do like at the holidays because, it reminds me of her. It's something she would have loved that I carried on. Yeah. So we can think about sort of values, or maybe it is, I want to have a close family the way that my grandparents, managed to do that. So coming up with things that are meaningful, kind of as a value, and then what would a person who valued that do? Part is both probably harder and also, again, I think often requires support, is experimenting, right? Like going out and trying something that you're not sure if it's going to make you very happy, but staying at home on the couch is definitely not making you happy. And so it may be worth trying something that could feel meaningful and probably trying it more than once. So the first time, you go out to dinner with your couple friends, if your spouse isn't there, the first time is probably not going to feel really good. It's probably going to be pretty hard. But then the second time you go, it may still be hard, but you may also think, oh, but I'd never had that pasta before, and that was pretty good, So it's sort of this slow upward spiral, I think, of what makes sense now, what works now, but you're only going to learn that by sort of trying things out.
Yeah. So beautiful. So the Grieving Brain, the surprising science of how we learn from love and loss. Decades of research and work and expertise and interviews went into this book. If you could send readers away with sort of one token or nugget to carry with them, what would it be about the Grieving Brain and from this beautiful book?
I think probably the thing I get most often as a question is, someone describes something and says, is this normal? Should I be over this by now? Or should a friend be over this by now? And just really trying to give yourself some kindness. This is a door you walk through, but once you're through the door, there's no end point. You are now a person who understands life differently than you did before. And so remembering that what you feel is normal and a lot of what you do is normal. And we can decide, okay, I do that pretty regularly. Do I want to do something different? Or I feel that pretty regularly. How am I going to manage the fact that I feel that? Those are really legitimate questions and things we can work with ourselves. But the fact that you feel things intensely or that you believe things or are motivated to do things that you're surprised by, that doesn't make them not normal. And so giving ourselves some loving kindness that this is really hard. This just is really hard. And what you're experiencing is normal and you're gonna find a way through.
Because of what you just said and because of all that, this book feels in so many ways like a companion and in many ways sort of like a roadmap or a guide or a hand to hold, not only as we go through the experience of grieving, but just the experience of being human.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Mary Frances. What advice would you have to aspiring writers?
Oh, to aspiring writers. That's a great question. I think for me, what I've learned is you got to write. It sounds really obvious, but I write every morning, and only on weekdays I write, for an hour every morning. And I think this is the piece. When inspiration strikes, I will be at my desk and it will have a place to go, right? If you're not at your desk, you can't write it down.
Absolutely. And as you said, first time might be hard. Keep doing it.
Yes.
Keep doing it right. And eventually you will get the inspiration down on the page. The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. Mary Frances, how can readers connect with you and learn about your journey with this?
I have a website at maryfrancesoconnor.org, and also I'm on Twitter at Dr. MFO. So reach out.
Wonderful. Mary Frances O'Connor, The Grieving Brain, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book, sharing this book, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for bringing this conversation to people.
Have a beautiful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.